Yeah, so I want to welcome you here today. Thank you for coming out and joining me, John, with Madrona Recovery. You and I have worked together in the past, and so I was happy when I reached out to see what you were doing and if you were available to come talk that you were up for it. So thank you for joining us.
Tyee, thanks for the opportunity to come out here and talk to you. It's been a little while, so glad to kind of rehash and see.
Yeah, we have a bunch of things to catch up on, and I thought before, I know you have a question for me, and so I think that'll be fun for us to talk through. But maybe before we do that, just to kind of set the stage, we can talk a little bit about Madrona Recovery itself. What does it do? Who does it serve? What kind of services does it provide?
Sure. Madrona Recovery is a residential adolescent program, and we serve kids 13 to 17 with mental health and addiction issues, and/or addiction issues. And so we opened about 2 years ago. It took a long time to get doors open, but we've served about 300 families so far. And our mission is to serve kids effectively and quickly so that they can get back home, get back into their schools, and have long-term success. So that's the mission we set out on.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Given where it's at today, is what the company is doing today, is that what you always planned it to do?
Yes, very much so. What I understood was that pivoting was going to be challenging. If we changed what we did, it was going to be challenging not only for our staff, but also very expensive for us to do. And some of the experience share that I got from other mentors and people who were helping me along the way, recognizing that you really did want to stay true to your vision, to your mission. And yes, we do listen to ideas and opportunities, but we always have in mind, what are we good at, what are we doing, and maintaining that. So it's been important for us to sustain that mission.
Mm-hmm. Now, not all businesses that I've worked with or that I've seen over the years will actually start out with a plan. They don't necessarily do a very what I would consider a thorough pre-planning phase, and that's one of the things that I thought was great and respected about the process that you went through, and that's how you and I met. Is that you and I worked together during the pre-operation phase of the business to put together what we refer to as a planning model, and really try to line out in as much detail as possible the financial situation of getting this thing started and off the ground. So yeah, thank you for working with me on that. That was definitely a great experience for us.
And thank you for supporting me through that, because it required a lot of planning. This was very cash intensive. We started off opening doors. We had to have 30 plus employees. We had to secure a building. We had to go through SBA to get the lending. And we had to do a lot of convincing and know what we were doing in advance. And so it took a great deal of planning. And so going through consultants and making sure we were effective in that plan had to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, you and I were talking just before we started recording about you were asking me about kind of what was I thinking at the time about your prospects and how you were approaching it and that sort of thing. I don't know, maybe you can tee that question up again for me.
Well, yeah, I had a notion. I definitely have done this work for a long time. I knew there was an opportunity. This region is really underserved. So I came into this not half-cocked, but with a good understanding that this work needed to be done, could be done with a certain model very well. But a reality was I'm a teacher by trade and not a business person. But with a plan, with a business plan, coming to you and trying to figure out if this was doable and viable. I didn't know if I was a fraud or if I could actually pull this off. Going through the motions was important, but I didn't know what it was going to take. And in fact, actually 2 years into it, if I had known how challenging this was going to be, I might not have done it. It was very expensive. There were slings and arrows along the way, and part of it was making sure I could just jump in and get going. But yeah, 2 years later, meeting with you now, I'm curious. Did you have? Were you thinking that I could do this? And was it possible?
Yeah, I was. I mean, I think it's very interesting to hear your perspective on that, because I didn't have any doubts about your ability to do it. I think with any of the entrepreneurs that we work with that are pre-operations, there's always a big question mark about, do you really have the cash behind you?
Yeah.
And so, and that part, it's kind of like, well, we talk about it, but there's only so far that I push with clients on that question. It's somewhat private. A lot of times where the cash is coming from is private, in terms of, is it coming from friends or family or other investors? And so for us, that's, we're usually getting paid along the way anyway, but in terms of whether we believe in the total outcome, whether there's cash there to make it happen or not is somewhat of a leap of faith on our side in terms of the entrepreneurs that we work with. But in terms of, did you actually have the skill set and ability to do this and carry it through? I never really doubted that. And it kind of reminds me, because this morning before our interview, I was telling somebody who I was interviewing, I was explaining what you did and your organization. And I think I've been one of the few organizations. I don't work with not-for-profits that often, and you're not a not-for-profit, but you are mission-driven. Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of people like to say they're mission-driven. I think a lot of entrepreneurs, and they are, right? But if I'm working with a SaaS company who's building an app that does something great, and maybe it helps society in some way or whatever, it's not really the same thing as mission-driven as what your organization does. And so when I was explaining this morning this issue, they asked me, they said, well, is this a not-for-profit organization? And I said, well, not structurally, it wasn't set up that way, but it's a very mission-driven organization, and the operator is somebody who had experience in this industry and is entrepreneurial to the extent that he wanted to build an organization around what he wanted to do with his life. And so I think my sense that was who you were is why I didn't have a lot of doubt about your ability to carry it through. Mm-hmm. It's that there's been a lot of discussion. There was a book called Grit. It's that grit or that tenacity to really be into. I mean, you were into this. You didn't just decide one day, hey, I want to start a rehab facility. You were involved in this industry and this process and committed to it, and this was just a natural iteration for you. And I think that's what gave me confidence in your ability to do that.
It's funny. Being a for-profit company that serves children, adolescents, it is a little bit of a sell to others because, it doesn't sound very good. And the reality for me is I looked at being a nonprofit. The only way for me to get this started was to secure an SBA loan, and it was
right.
But
I remember that. Yeah.
It's hard to explain that, and what is my intention to start this business? Is it greed? That's a little bit of a sell to some folks, and
sure.
And, I do come across that, but no doubt, I did start this because I saw an opportunity to serve kids and families in a new model, in a way that was exceptional. I had a team of folks who were excited to join us, and we've been able to carry that out, which is wonderful, and it is what compels us.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think from I'd put my 2 cents on the not-for-profit thing. I have worked with not-for-profits. I do work with a couple of not-for-profits in our portfolio now, but I think sometimes it is misleading. People don't understand that the structural aspect of being a not-for-profit doesn't necessarily mean you're more or less mission driven as an organization. From my perspective, I think there's organizations like yours that I've had the opportunity to work with that are very mission driven. There's not-for-profits that are kind of mission driven, but kind of not. But the thing is that if your organization was a not-for-profit, it would be what we would consider, it would be organized generally around program revenues and program fees. And the truth about most not-for-profits that are organized around program revenues and program fees is they do in fact operate very much like for-profits. There's very little structural difference between the two. So yeah, if I were able to talk to some of those doubters, I would throw out there my 2 cents that I would say focus on how mission driven the organization is and less about what that legal framework looks like, because that part is complex and doesn't necessarily mean what you think it does. Yeah,
That's fair. Yeah.
So what, we've been talking about, my confidence in your ability to have pulled this off because of your background and because of your commitment to the profession and the industry that you're in. What got you into this field to begin with?
As early as in college, I was doing this work in some capacity, and I've done in various settings most aspects of this type of work in direct care. And I've loved it. And actually, this working with kids in crisis and dealing with trauma is not for everyone. But I've enjoyed it. I see the benefits of being able to help others, and it's contagious. And I wouldn't want to do anything else. I was lucky enough to combine teaching. I got my master's 15 years ago with therapy, and so it became a wonderful kind of ability to carry on. And so I was able to teach, convey, and be a part of that direct care work. And so, being able to see what works, what doesn't, and trying to impact change with an organization before, and I was not able to kind of impact change internally. Recognized that it was a lot easier to start a new organization to impact that change than it was to kind of blow it up and recreate, and that's very challenging to do. So that's kind of where it started, the seeds of kind of what it could be and where I came from.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned kind of when you started, you had to have about 30 people on staff right out of the gate. Yeah. Where is that today? Is it about the same? Has it grown?
We're about 50 now,
oh, wow.
And we've got 3 psychiatrists. It's a very medical model. We've got nurses, therapists, addiction counselors. There's just, our ratios are very high. We've got a lot of direct care work, and it's expensive. And it's expensive to provide that level of care. It's needed, and the types of kids that we see do require those ratios. And so we're at 50, and we'll be growing in the next year to provide some additional care and to expand our services. But it's very cash intensive.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I imagine with a team of that size, you get into starting to think about company culture and how you create that for the organization. And I guess because you work so intimately with the clients, it probably bleeds into the work with the clients as well. So yeah, what can you say about how you view and deal with company culture?
Well, we have been so busy just making this work that sometimes you have to step back and just realize culture is everything. That the work we do directly with the kids is the same work that we must do with ourselves, and to just recognize and acknowledge that trauma is real, that we need to take care of our kids, our staff. To step back, to really involve and support not only the kids but the staff as well, and sometimes you can't do that yourself. So bringing in external help and therapists and other providers to help really further the values that you have, and so that's been important for us.
Do you find that the industry and the profession beyond your company has kind of a culture to it that's positive that you're able to leverage off of? Is that part of what you deal with?
We do, and it's important to stay connected to our community partners. And I think there's an acknowledgement of how challenging this work is, and a lot of grace that's provided for those who struggle. And really an acknowledgement that at the end of the day, you want to take care of these families and these kids as best you can. So we've had other partners who may be considered competitors who've turned to us and said, well, this kiddo is dealing with more of an addiction issue. We think it's important for them to be with you as opposed to us. And that's very real. And I think at the heart of it, we all are looking for, finding the right fit, finding the best care. And so that has been actually maybe a surprising thing that I've seen. That there isn't so much of a competitive nature, but finding the right fit.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's interesting. I planned to ask you here. I realize I asked you this before the recording and didn't even recognize it. But so we talked a little bit about this before. So maybe we'll go over this ground again about finances, whether finances have been an issue or whether the program is mostly self-sustaining at this point.
It is self-sustaining, and we are realizing a profit at this point. But the realities are that this was so cash-intensive that it took a long time to get our contracts with insurance companies. Insurance companies want to make sure that your program is effective, that you're doing what you say you can do, and so you have to demonstrate that. And so that time, before we got our contracts, was challenging, and so we, the debt we incurred was intense at the beginning, and so we've got some climbing to do. We have been able to pay off some of that debt.
That's fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, it took a little while, and it's nice to be in a place where we're self-sustaining.
Yeah, that's great. What other kinds of challenges? And I think maybe before I ask this question, I think maybe it'd be helpful to set more context. Would you mind telling us a little bit about, in maybe a little more detail, the programs that you run? Do you have multiple programs that the organization is running?
We have a residential program right now that consists of a campus of 2 buildings, and so our kids will come in. Usually, they're coming in from emergency departments, and they'll meet our therapists. They'll become a part of our community for 21 to 30 days is typically a stay for us. And our objective really is to get these kids as stable as possible and get them out. It's an unfortunate state that these kids have to be in our program at all. But when it's life-threatening, we need to get a plan together with the parents, with the kids, and get them in a place where they can be successful. So that's what we've focused on from day one. And we recognize that there's a continuum of care that's necessary. So how do we help support kids who do need a little bit extra help when they leave? And so that means reaching out to schools, making sure that our kids have allies and advocates within the schools and outpatient programming that's effective and needed for them. So our work will extend to making sure that is done effectively. And yes, there are opportunities for us to do potentially longer term work as well, as long as it stays connected to our mission.
And so have there been any unexpected or expected challenges in the operation?
From the mentors that I have talked to and folks who've offered their experience share, some of the things that I didn't know before opening doors, I now know, and it's been painful to see, in particular, interpersonal conflict with staff. The work we do is incredibly challenging. Sometimes people have their own trauma that they haven't dealt with. They're well-meaning. They get into this work and they realize it's just either too challenging, not for them, not the right fit. And I think I've taken on some personal strife with seeing folks who I believe in, who I know are very dedicated to what they do, when they leave, especially with feelings of pain and grief around their experience, I feel that deeply, and it's painful.
Yeah.
I don't like it. When we've had families who come to us in really crisis, not knowing if their child is going to be living for very long, and that is about as intense a moment as you get. We want their experience to be exceptional and to be very positive, and if it's not, that likewise is extremely intense for all of our staff.
Yeah.
And really, we're not an easy button. We're a program that can help get things started and moving in the right direction, but the path for these kids is very challenging. It's intense, and so I struggle with some of the feelings that other folks have, and I feel a great deal of responsibility for those kids, those families, and the staff.
Yeah, I think it takes a lot of imagination on my part to try to put myself in your shoes and thinking about the staff and their work and their commitment and the stakes that they're dealing with just ups the ante on those interpersonal relationships. I grew up working in public accounting firms where we're doing accounting for other organizations, and there's kind of a saying that goes around because a lot of times in accounting and finance firms and organizations, people are very highly driven. They want to move to the next level, and that can create interpersonal conflict, and it can create these intense issues. And it often, I think there's a sensibility for some of us that it often is blown out of proportion, or it lacks perspective when people are intense in those kind of environments. And what a lot of my colleagues will say, and I've probably been known to say it as well, is, okay, let's back up for a second. When we're doing accounting work, we're not saving lives here. And so I think about that in relation to what you do. I mean, it's actually the opposite. You literally, in some cases, are affecting and saving people's lives, and that's a whole different deal. Yeah.
While it is true that it's painful to see when people don't have the experience that they're hoping for, the converse is very true as well. So we have a ton of success stories, and I see the connections that our staff have with kids, the community that we've created, and it is compelling. It's what drives all of us to do the work that we do, and it feeds us.
Yeah.
So, but what stays with me are the challenging things, and especially folks that I have brought on board, who I've worked with and believe in for a long time, and it's not the experience they've got. It stays with me, and I think I don't want to be callous or just unkind or unfeeling to that, because it's very real for them.
Mm-hmm.
And but I do appreciate what we are able to do, and it feeds us.
Yeah. And speaking of that, I think I think you're basically answering my next question, which is, what kind of benefits have you felt from operating your own business? And so I think you're talking about the intrinsic benefits that perhaps your entire team can have access to in terms of participating in the mission. Taking it from there and maybe going a step further, what kind of benefits have you experienced being the head of a business?
A lot of growth, and some of it's painful, but being able to effectively support and empower employees has been something that I'm continuing to learn how to do. I did direct care for a long time, and I became very good at some of those jobs. But my job now is not to take over, to jump in moments of crisis, but to see our employees really step up, to learn how to do that themselves, to feel as if they are capable and they can do anything, and really allow them to really operate at the top of their scope of work. And so, my job is really to support, encourage, empower them, and to get out of their way. And it's been a learning curve for sure. I think in a lot of ways, the less I do, the better off we are.
Yeah. No, that's I definitely can relate to that. I mean, in my own business opportunities, the things that I work on, that's exactly where I'm at. What I'm trying to achieve is build a team of people that I can work with that can get some benefit out of me mentoring them and helping them develop and helping them do consulting for customers and put content out for the community and things of that nature. Well, thank you so much for joining us for this. I appreciate it. And I know, I think our audience is going to find it interesting to kind of hear from an entrepreneur where the mission is really front and center. So this is a great opportunity for us. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Tyee.
Yeah. Okay. And for our viewers, next up, we're going to hit our roundtable discussion. So I'll see you all there. All right. Okay, well, welcome guys to this week's roundtable discussion. We got a few different things that we've spotted on the web to discuss this week. So I'll let you get started, Charlie, with the first topic.
Okay, sounds good. So the first topic I want to talk about is I found an article on a site called domainnamewire.com wherein it discusses the sale of the top-level domain for .org, and it's being sold to Ethos Capital. And so what it basically means is that companies who want to begin a new website that ends in .org will be paying more for that in the near future. They're thinking that the price is going to rise about 10% a year as a result of the sale. What was really interesting about it was that the sale was for over $1 billion, and it looked like the estimate of how long it was going to take for them to recoup their money was a little over 5 years. And so I guess the reason I wanted to bring it up was just to kind of discuss sort of the ethics of the idea that somebody is buying and selling something so basic as the top level domain of like .org or .com, and just kind of get your guys' feel on whether or not you think that's something that should even be happening.
Right.
It was very controversial just because it wasn't widely publicized or discussed before it happened, and so a lot of people didn't even really know this is happening. A lot of nonprofits and other businesses are kind of up in arms about it, and so
Well, I mean, I didn't even realize that somebody could own the .org. I didn't know that was something that was owned. I mean, I know businesses and in my own businesses, I've registered domain names, the entire name, but I didn't realize that. I didn't realize there was an owner of the .org. So I guess whoever owns, I guess that would mean there's an owner of the .com as well.
I suppose so.
Yeah.
Good question.
All of
I'm
them.
not
.tb.
sure.
All those other extensions, right?
Yeah. .net.
And so, I mean, these folks get a cut of the fee every time so if we register a domain name with .org or .com, those people are getting a slice of the pie. Is that what's happening? Oh,
that is correct.
Wow. Yeah. No, I mean, I didn't realize that. I mean, I assume the fee did. I assume somebody owned some part of the network capacity, and the fee was going somewhere beyond the domain provider or whoever I was registering with. But I didn't know it was specific that somebody owned the .org.
Yeah, and it used to be owned by the thing called ISOC, which is the Internet Society, and so I think it was more in the lines of what you were imagining, which is that there's sort of either no one owns it or one centralized group owns it, but this is the first time it's going to pass hands between that and a privately held company.
And if I'm correct, I think this almost happened before.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I believe this was a story, I want to say like 10 or 15 years ago.
Wow.
That the Internet Society took over .org because they were going to sell it to some venture capitalist or something that was going to use it. But then .org, I guess, is synonymous with like nonprofit organizations, and not saying that there's a bunch of spoof websites out there, but not necessarily everything with .org is a nonprofit. There are for-profits that use that .org name. But nonprofits are definitely upset. All the ones that I have talked to, are like really upset about.
Yeah, I mean, it adds to the controversy of this, right? Because it's like, because it is specifically the ending, the domain ending that's used for not-for-profits,
right?
So to have it bought by somebody who's basically trying to extract cash flows from it, you can see how that would.
Well, and the nonprofit space is kind of interesting from like an entrepreneurial or like a business point of view because the tax changes that happened with the individual deductions or the itemized deductions that happened in the tax plan has really changed the way that nonprofits are receiving donations. It's done through like a donor advised fund now, through stocks or usually, and and so now they're changing the way that they do their .orgs as well. Nonprofits are kind of been, they have to be more agile, I guess, these days in how they're finding funds because it's not, you no longer have like a Schedule A person that itemizes they still give, but they don't get a tax deduction usually now for it.
Well, it just goes to show you that every kind of business has its own set of problems, and that even when you think something is simple or stagnant, then things are still always changing in those industries too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I wonder what kind of controls there are to prevent the owner of .org from just raising the rent, so to speak, on the use of .org. Because I guess that's what it is. When we register a domain name, we're renting to some extent part of that.
At least with an option to buy.
Yeah,
Yeah. It's a good question. I doubt with current FCC rules, they've been so pro, I guess, marketplace where they're not viewing the internet, I guess, as a utility under the current FCC. So I doubt and that's the only thing I can think of that would have governmental oversight over a .org. I don't know of any other government agency that would be able to step in and stop, or cap what that cost would be.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder, I guess the other thing that comes to my mind is I wonder if, we've seen this, it seems like in the last couple of years, and I know there was some news about this, that there's been a lot of .other stuff. So there's like a whole expanded list of the endings that your domain names can have now, right?
Yep.
And I mean, what's the control on that? I mean, can anyone just create their own ending then and become a company that licenses it? Or
no, there definitely are. I'm not sure how they all got started or how they're formed, but there's definitely a finite list of them, and so it's not the case that you can go make .Charlie or it's,
all right.
They're definitely.
I think it has to be limited to like a three characters. Is that correct? Or up to 3 characters? Because you have the .eu, .az, like those, like Australia is what, AU.
I can't think of a counter to that. I could think of 2s and 3s. I can't think of anything
4s,
longer.
Because like .tv, like Twitch.tv is one. That was a hot one that was selling. They had radio ads for .tv domain names on Howard Stern when Howard Stern first went to Sirius.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So they do advertising and sell like that, like a normal business.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a whole industry, and there's a lot to know about it.
And I mean, the way they talked about it is almost like an annuity. They pay a price to buy it, and then they expect to get a certain amount of cash back from it. So it's just, I mean, I guess it does depend on the volume of organizations using that domain, but they're dealing with big data here, so they kind of know on average what that's going to look like, and so they're just going to get a payback on their investment.
Yeah, it was saying that the current wholesale price of these .org domains is about $9.93, and that they expect that will probably double across the next 10 years as a result of this happening. And they talked a little bit about the cost structure and what it means for profitability, but of course the main takeaway is the price doubling in the next set of years.
I see. Wow. Well, yeah, and then that leads to the not-for-profits you were talking about being upset by this.
Yeah, 'cause I mean, $10. I think it's more like they've just felt slight. Like for a long time, donate, like revenue streams and kind of what their expenses were for nonprofits were pretty static. You had governmental income, you had donations, you had really, that's probably, the grants and donations and government, entitlement grants is what it's called, but really it's just governmental grants, donations as revenue sources, grants, private foundations. That's kind of shifted now, where your private donations come in as a donor advised fund, and investment. So you take part of your investment, and then that's how they're being advised to donate now for taxability purposes. So it's different, and the ones that are benefiting are agile enough to be able to recognize this and go after those donor advised funds and ask for them to be part of the list. But it is a reduction in their revenue stream. So it's changed, and I think this is a change to them. It's kind of been changing, so I think rolling with the punches is good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to do that.
All right. Well, what I looked at this week, I looked at an article about the app Robin Hood. Have you guys heard of this app before?
I have heard of it, yeah.
A little bit, yeah.
So I guess apparently the app allows, it's very popular among millennials, is what is what the article I read said. But I think, I mean, the features seem like they'd be popular to anyone in the sense that it's a trading platform that allows for free trades in terms of stocks and other kinds of investments like EITFs and things of that nature. And so that kind of got me inspired. I think I'd heard about Robin Hood maybe just in the background as something that maybe I saw an ad for or an article for or something in the past. But when I saw this particular article, it inspired me to look into it more. The article I was looking at was actually talking about the fact that the Robin Hood app is part of this emerging industry that they refer to as fintech, which is financial oriented products and services that are combined with technology, probably most prominently with apps would be. Mm-hmm. And so the Robin Hood app, that's a trading platform that you can trade stocks. I haven't even looked at it myself, but I'm imagining it's like something you can do on your phone.
Yep.
So, that would be a prime example of a fintech type company, right? And I know a little bit from having talked to other fintech kind of companies 2 to 3 years ago, people who worked with fintech type companies 2 to 3 years ago, is that they were kind of like technology companies that were a surface layer that would layer over the top of traditional finance companies. So like banks, like online banking platforms and things that were designed to be kind of a smoother, more elegant user interface for a bank online or in an app format. In those early stages, those companies weren't actually banks themselves. They were basically just the surface layer that would go over the top of a traditional bank, and they would be underwritten by another bank that was the actual bank, right? And so what was interesting about this article to me is that they were talking about how Robin Hood was attempting, and maybe this was more widespread, that other fintech companies were trying to become federally chartered banks in and of themselves. And and apparently there was an agency with the U.S. government, a federal agency that, and I don't remember the exact name of the agency, but it actually had rolled out some rules and a program to actually help fintech companies do this, like a streamlined program specifically for fintech companies to help them more easily become federally chartered banks. And Robin Hood was pursuing this, and that's what this article was about, that Robin Hood was pursuing this, but it got called to a halt because a federal court in New York said, hey, wait a minute, this federal agency running this program just didn't have the authority to set up a special program for fintech like that. And so they called a halt to it. And that meant that Robin Hood and anyone else in the fintech community that may have been trying to rely on this program had to plan to go through the normal process and procedure to become a federally chartered bank, which I can only imagine is a pretty onerous and highly regulated process. And so, as you might suspect, then Robin Hood, what the article was about, it was how the app Robin Hood, the company, promptly withdrew their application to become a federally chartered bank once this program was no longer available to them. So yeah, that was that particular article. But I want to tell you about another part of it, because that's kind of almost like inside baseball, almost a little too technical and industry specific to be super interesting, other than just from my standpoint, just understanding whether these apps are actually banks themselves or not. But that inspired me to kind of look at anything else going on with Robin Hood. And just a couple of days ago, another article came out. I think it was from Fortune, and they were talking about how looking from the outside, because Robin Hood is a private company, looking from the outside, it appears that Robin Hood may be similar to other technology startups that we've seen in recent history that look like they're plays for really high margin technology companies, but in fact, under the hood, they're just grinding it out. Like it's really a low margin business. And the article had done enough legwork to understand that the way that Robinhood makes its money was primarily off of order flow or deal flow, and they get kickbacks from market makers for the amount of deal flow that is kind of pumping through the app, so to speak. And the implication that the article was making, and I don't have enough experience to understand that entirely, but the implication was that's a tough way to make your money.
It sounds like it.
That's not a high margin way to make money. And so the suspicion, the author's suspicion was, and they don't know whether Robinhood is actually profitable or not because their financial statements aren't public, but the suspicion was that they may be as unprofitable as some of the other companies that we've seen recently having problems, like a WeWork and Uber and so on. So, yeah.
I just think it's crazy how many of these tech companies are into like a banking type of situation, like Apple Pay, Google Pay. I mean, I don't know what differentiates Apple Pay from like a normal checking account, and whether it's not, I don't know if it's FDI.
Well, that's
Google.
AJ keeps searching his Google.
Always listening.
His Google assistant keeps talking
admit
to
that
us.
you don't know something without it looking it up.
I know,
for you.
right? I'm just going to turn this thing off.
Yeah, I think the interesting distinction here comes in just drawing the fine line between what is a money transmitter versus what is a bank, because I think a lot of these businesses have been kind of walking that fine line as we get closer and blur the lines between those two. And I think it all comes down to regulation and KYC and AML, so know your customer and anti-money laundering policies that are required of both banks and money transmitters, but to different levels. And so I think, having a clear distinction. And like you were talking about, another one of those layered companies that fits between the banks would be Zelle, where they've added their service as a money transmitter into a bunch of existing banks. And so it's another example of this expanding fintech industry. And it's just constantly changing all the time. Well,
and the other ones were like those round up, kind of investment apps that charge like heavy fees, like Acorn. I forget the other one. There's one other one. Acorn was the one that advertises heavily. I can't remember the name of the other one, but there's another similar one that will round up, like if your purchase is for $53.59, then it'll round up to $54 and invest that small amount into like a mutual fund or something like that.
Is that they call it micro investing?
Micro investing,
right?
Yes,
right. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the philosophical issues on this that's interesting to me is these technology companies that are kind of coming in and creating application layers that then can kind of layer on top of the traditional banks. I guess the question that comes to my mind is, okay, why does it take a technology-specific company to do that? What is it about the banks themselves that makes them unable to create an app for an app for their own front end? If they're already a bank, like if one of the challenges in the fintech industry is that the technology companies that are basically creating these user interfaces and these apps are not actually banks, and that creates regulatory hurdles for them. Why is there a space for them to do this? Why aren't the banks stepping up and doing this for themselves?
I think it's partially comes from just consistency across banks and platforms and how they are set up. And so it's like when Wells Fargo sets up their system versus when Bank of America does, they weren't designed intentionally to be able to speak back and forth with one another as easily as somebody who's in the middle trying to build a connection between those two and can focus on that problem. Because I think there's just a lot of compatibility, and that's why Zelle is available on certain banks and not others, because it's just whatever that company chooses to focus its resources in. I know nothing really about it, but I can imagine that it could be a pretty daunting task to try to get a system that is compatible with so many banks and, remove some of the timelines and how long it takes to move money and add some functionality that the banks didn't really have.
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the cynical side of me thinks that it's also like the banks are not wading into that because they look at it as an inappropriate risk for them, right?
No, yeah.
You know, and so then they're like, well, let's let these young punks and tech companies, like, we'll let them take these risks and kind of play around in this. But I mean, to me, that says something. That says that maybe, you know, some of these companies that are on the technology side may be playing a little fast and loose from what we would expect from an actual bank.
Yeah.
in terms of how they're doing things. And that article that I was looking at with regard to Robin Hood was alluding to that issue and saying that there had been some feature issues that could create serious problems for the app and for counterparties and that were using the app, sort of thing. So yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about what that looks like in terms of, well, the other thing that was interesting about that is they said that in order to kind of shore themselves up on that on regulatory and better company oversight, that they had actually just hired a CFO and a COO.
They didn't have a CFO or a COO before.
Yeah, this is a company with I think hundreds of millions of dollars in valuation, if not, you know, just large valuation, and playing in a very big space. And this article was saying that they just hired a CFO. So I was like, what?
Wow.
Maybe all startups are the same.
Yeah. I mean, I was like, well, okay, if that's the benchmark, you know, several $100 million in valuation before you hire a CFO, I guess, yeah, nobody in town needs one, really.
Well, could this be an indication that maybe the tech sector is going to slow down? Like, Google and Apple are so large, and they've eaten so many companies by buying them, that all the ones that were good ideas or the ones that were profitable have, like, basically already been bought. And the ones that are valued now are kind of like the leftovers that look okay for a minute, you know? But I think that the luster wears off when you kind of open up the hood and see what's going on in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think with all of the, because most of this news about Robinhood, to be fair to the company, is somewhat speculative because it's private. So there's a lot that we don't know, and the authors are kind of making some assumptions just based on outside observations and an analysis of their apparent business model and so on. But I think that speaks to your point that people are speculating on companies like Robinhood about problems. They're speculating on problems because of the well-known problems in the tech community that have been occurring over the last year. So, I mean, I don't know of a specific slowdown that I've heard right now, but yeah, that it seems like the more news that maybe there's been an overfunding of companies that aren't really able to deliver on the value proposition. The more news like that there is, of course, the more likely there is for people to slow down in funding them, right?
And I think it's also important to just note that this withdrawal of the bank charter application was voluntary by them as well. And so I think it's partially a choice to focus on what they think they excel at and realize, and looking at that decision and deciding, okay, that maybe doesn't make sense for our organizational objectives. And so,
right.
Yeah, I think it's worth noting.
Right. All right. Well, I want to thank you guys again for a good roundtable discussion, good topics this week, and thank our audience. Thank you for joining us, and please hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so you can see when we're coming out, like us, and tell your friends and colleagues about us so we can continue growing this program and this community for you all. All right, we'll see you guys next time.